Hello and a very warm welcome to the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. We're recording on a Monday morning, just before the Prime Minister convenes a COBRA meeting to deal with the increasing disorder in many cities throughout the United Kingdom. Of course, this all started off with the absolutely appalling events in Southport last week, which left many families absolutely traumatised by the events of that stabbing in a community collectively in mourning. But since then, fueled by misinformation in social media, we've seen disorder in many places in the United Kingdom. And indeed, a very, very quick trawl through the newspapers today, and we can simply see how this is reflected. The Scotsman front page: Starmer vows far-right thugs will regret this disorder. The Daily Record: fury at Tommy Robinson poison. Fascist stab lie to stir hate, says the Record. The Scottish Sun says, day of shame, riot thugs attack migrants in hotel. And the Scottish Daily Mail refers to Tinderbox Britain stoking race riots from his sunbed, and they have a picture of Tommy Robinson on holiday on a sunbed. The Times: riot inciters face reckoning, and the Daily Telegraph: far right clash with Muslims in rioting. Alex, this would appear to be the first major test of Keir Starmer's premiership.
It is in certain respects that. I agree with you there, Bernard. I mean, I think this is not a situation that has arisen or been created by the new Labour government, obviously. The government is still only a month old. The idea that Labour is somehow responsible for any of this is plainly preposterous. But how you deal with events is, of course, one of the tests of political leadership, and you need to have a certain nimbleness to do so. And here I think we can draw a parallel with the riots that took place in London and other cities across England in 2011, when Keir Starmer was Director of Public Prosecutions in England. And the prosecution service took a very, very harsh line on people committing acts of violence and disorder then. Courts were allowed to sit overnight. Special measures were brought in to fast-track prosecutions, and some very hefty, exemplary sentences were handed out, much to the disdain and criticism from parts of liberal England. The Guardian was appalled by the way in which people who'd been looting shops were suddenly sentenced to 3, 4, 5 years in prison. I suspect the attitude to swift prosecutions for the disorder seen this week will be met with greater enthusiasm by the Guardian this time, because the nature of the rioting and the disorder is very different. In 2011, it was a sort of reaction to the shooting of a black man by police officers in London. This time, it is, as you refer, it's in response to the disorder encouraged following the appalling stabbing in Southport of 3 little girls being murdered, and then this has been sort of exacerbated, obviously, by social media, which is one of the big differences between now and 2011. That although social media existed then, it wasn't its own sort of ecosystem, its own political culture in anything like the same way it is now. It is much easier for things to be organised, albeit on a sort of distributed basis. I'm not entirely sure that Tommy Robinson is actually organising these protests, these riots. I suspect he is piggybacking on them to some degree, and not everybody who is involved in these demonstrations, to give them a term that perhaps dignifies them more than they merit, is actually raising concerns about levels of immigration into the UK. Some of it is just young men and perhaps and some young women and so on having a laugh. The riots in Belfast are clearly not a protest against immigration. I think that it's just an opportunity for mayhem, and some people will take advantage of that that opportunity. But you're right. How the government deals with this is a way of demonstrating whether it has the nimbleness and the grip required to get a hold of these situations. And I would expect that the 2011 precedent suggests that the prosecution service, particularly in England, will come down very, very heavily on people who have been arrested and will shortly be convicted for acts of violence.
Yeah, I think there's always a question when you observe this kind of disorder, public disorder. Is it something which is going to last for a finite time, or is it a portent of something which is going to happen time and again because there are underlying issues which are going to fuel that? Now, I mean, I've been around long enough where I've seen different bits of disorder. I can remember way back in the early 1980s, there were riots in Tottenham, there were riots in Toxteth, sometimes the genesis of these public disorder incidents were to do with race. Sometimes they were to do with a perception that communities were marginalized. But with the benefit of hindsight, what you can say is that certain disorder is about letting off steam at a particular moment in time. It is not necessarily evidence that something more long-term is going to be at play here. So I think the first question is that in a week's time, when hopefully these incidents of public disorder will be behind us, will we look back and say this was all linked to misinformation, let's stress that, about one particular heinous event, and it simply died a death as you would expect it to be? Or is this something which is going to perhaps be the norm in the future? Now, I don't know what the answer to that is. What I think is quite interesting is that the Prime Minister has been up and running very, very quickly in this. Sometimes there is a tendency on politicians of the left to say that this is a public order issue, it's a criminal justice issue, we'll allow the police to get on with their jobs, we'll allow it to come before the courts eventually, and the system will do what the system is going to do. But he had police officers in number 10 Downing Street last week. There's the Cobra meeting later on today that he'll be chairing. There was that address yesterday, and Keir Starmer is a guy with a monotone voice. It is sometimes difficult to elicit what his true emotions are. He clearly is absolutely furious about this. The language which he used, far-right thuggery, clear, unambiguous, making the point that people who are engaged in this kind of disorder will live to regret this. This is pretty strong stuff. It would be pretty strong stuff from any Prime Minister. It's even stronger given that he was once DPP, where, of course, he understands just how the criminal justice system operates. And it could be the case, that you will get people fast-tracked through the courts. But first of all, important to say, there is still a presumption of innocence, and there should be. But preparing cases very, very quickly and precipitately in order to gain convictions to send a message for essentially political reasons, that sometimes is fraught with a little danger in that you run the risk that you're not thoroughly preparing cases against individuals. Let's sort of pose one question. In a sense, we don't know the answer to this, and that is the extent to which these offences which are taking place, are they coordinated? Is this part of a far-right group of individuals who are all in contact with one another in different parts of the UK who are fermenting this kind of disorder? Or is it actually spontaneous? Because if it's spontaneous, I would suggest it's extremely worrying indeed. If it's been fermented as part of a sort of far-right initiative to bring disorder, then we know that it's the coordinated actions of individuals who are probably known to the police anyway. What's your hunch about what's happening here? Spontaneous or organised, Alex?
Well, I think inconveniently, I suspect it's a bit of both. That is to say, there are organized groups, people who formerly used to be associated with organizations such as the English Defence League, which no longer really exists anymore. But nevertheless, the people obviously who were part of it do. I think there's a degree of coordination there, issuing calls for, patriotic citizens to take to the streets to express their concerns and so on. There's a degree of coordination there. But for the most part, I would suggest that the majority of the people who are taking to the streets are doing so in a more spontaneous kind of fashion. You mentioned that it's very difficult to ascertain the significance of events while they're happening, and I think that's absolutely true. You see these headlines, Britain ablaze, England in flames, and so on, and you think this is very dramatic. This is a week that will change Britain forever. Well, maybe it might. Again, go back to the 2011 riots and so on. Well, the same things were being said then, and yet a dozen years later and so on, I think many people had completely forgotten that those riots ever took place, let alone that they had a significance that led to Britain being changed in the short term, let alone for forever. But against that, and I think that is a plausible reading of the current situation. Against that, I think we should also be aware that these are not unique to, these events are not unique to the United Kingdom. They're not unique to England. They're not unique to Northern Ireland. We saw quite similar episodes taking place in the Republic of Ireland a few months ago. There again, there was a stabbing in Dublin that was initially attributed, I think incorrectly, to an asylum seeker. That prompted serious civil unrest for a number of nights in Dublin. The burning of cars, the looting of shops, a degree of violence on the streets. And that was, again, partially orchestrated, partially spontaneous. But again, you look at other European countries, you look at France, you look at Germany, you look at Italy, you have the advance of an anti-immigrant, ethnic-based politics in all of those countries, much more successfully than in the UK thus far. The same could be said in countries like Denmark, in Sweden, in Finland, where again, the far right, or what's termed as the far right, has a much stronger parliamentary footing than it does in the UK, notwithstanding reforms advances at the recent general election. So again, in an international context, or a European context, there are aspects of this that are not unusual now, that this is a new normal in Western European societies, where you have had, it is true, it is a simple fact, and we're perhaps, I think, somewhat isolated from this in Scotland, but for a number of reasons that we may get onto. But there has been an enormous amount of immigration into Western European countries over the last 20 years, and global demographic trends and economic realities suggest that is going to continue for the foreseeable future, placing considerable stress on, if you like, the host communities, not just in terms of public service, but also with questions of integration and so on. Now, the UK has a good story to tell on a lot of these things, but it's important to have that context, I think, to be able to understand, what seems to be happening in Britain this week, because it isn't unique, and so therefore, that should be remembered, I think, as a means of putting it in context.
Yeah, I think the other context which is important to stress is that the number of people who are actually engaged in this disorder as a proportion of the communities in which this disorder is taking place is actually very, very small. But one of the things which it does actually also indicate is just the power that social media plays in defining narratives, because in the old days when people got their news overwhelmingly from television and from the newspapers, there was clearly a discipline on broadcasters and newspaper people, at least to be accurate with the facts, and that controlled the narrative. I saw a piece, I think it was in the Times yesterday, which was an interview with the woman who is largely credited with starting all of this off. by tweeting that the individual that was responsible for these appalling events in Southport was Muslim. Now, the Times took the decision not to name this individual, but she had right-wing politics. That's fine. People are allowed to take a perspective which is right wing. But she was absolutely mortified at what she had done. And this, of course, is the danger with social media. It is the snowball effect, and it is then the responsibility of the much derided mainstream media to try and cut through this to give some kind of perspective. Now, I think that there will be people who, particularly in England, are concerned about levels of immigration. We know that this has been a live political and electoral issue for a number of years. As we've discussed in this podcast before, one of the problems that you have is the way in which quite distinct and separate issues are continuously conflated. The issue of legal migration becomes conflated with the issue of illegal immigration into the country, which comes conflated with the responsibilities that the country has to process asylum claims. And then there is the issues of the boats. And all you get, and what a lot of people get, is a whole load of noise around this where there's absolutely no explainers going on. And of course, those who are on the hard right, the neo-fascists who will be behind some of this, in a sense, are not concerned about the net migration figures because some of their points of view have nothing to do with rational debate about pressures on public services or legitimate mainstream concerns. These are being stoked up for an entirely different agenda around notions of race and nationality and purity, which have absolutely no place in any civilized political discourse. So I'm going to be interested to see what comes out of the Cobra meeting today, and I'm going to be interested to see what the response is. My hunch in all of this, and it is only my hunch, is that this time next year, we will simply say that there was a series of events, some of them spontaneous, some of them planned, pinned to a particularly distressing issue. But I think that the overwhelming majority of people in the country, and I saw some people in Sunderland say, we are not going to allow these people to hijack and misrepresent our community on the basis of what, coming back to the point, is statistically an insignificant number of people, but a statistically insignificant number of people who are capable of wreaking absolute havoc and misrepresenting the nature of the communities in which these disturbances are taking place.
Oh, I agree with all of that, absolutely. At the same time, I do think that there are longer term issues that have to be addressed with how the United Kingdom deals with matters of ethnicity and race. In many ways, the UK's transition from an almost exclusively white society to a multicoloured, multi-ethnic, multiracial society has been handled pretty successfully, certainly in comparison with other countries, that racial tensions have until now, on the whole, been relatively limited. That's not to downplay the seriousness of those tensions as and when they arise. It's certainly not to excuse any of the behaviour that we've seen on streets, Sunderland and elsewhere over the last few days, which are entirely reprehensible and poisonous. But there are issues that have to be addressed. I think that there are the way in which you're absolutely right. The way in which we talk about issues such as immigration is frequently lacking in any kind of nuance or subtlety. There is an assumption that everybody that all immigration is equal, and most people don't actually think that. Most people are quite happy with legal migration. People who who play by the rules as they see it. They are extremely uncomfortable with illegal immigration, and while they are sympathetic to people who claim asylum if they are fleeing persecution in a country such as Afghanistan, they are wholly less sympathetic, entirely less sympathetic to people who claim to be fleeing persecution from a country such as, say, Albania. And so I think most people are capable of drawing that distinction. But very often in the media, we have attempts that to blur any of these distinctions and so on. So if people are, stop the boats is a proxy really for an argument about illegal immigration. Well, every state has a duty to defend, protect, secure, enforce its borders. The United Kingdom is no different on that matter to anyone else. And if the state is perceived, fairly or not, to be failing in its duty to do that, then at some point you can expect a reaction to that. And yes, that will be exacerbated by social media. Yes, it will be exacerbated by malign actors, and I would include Nigel Farage in that, who has his own populist agenda that is transparent and seeks opportunity in chaos. But there is a duty to tease out the distinctions between these things in the same way as, I think there are certain warning lights blinking from the general election results. The rise of what we coyly term community voting, which is really ethnic voting. You look at the number of seats won by independent candidates in England. This was attributed to a protest over Gaza and so on, but it's also the nascent organization of a Muslim, or really actually Pakistani and Bangladeshi vote that is, organized along ethnic and religious lines. I think that is unhealthy because it is new. It's not just unhealthy because it's new. It's new and unhealthy, I think, in the UK, and that is something to be wary of. I think when you have mainstream or elite media that pushes a narrative that all immigration is good, then that can be quite dangerous. There was a meme on Twitter during the European Football Championships, which listed the England a team sheet of the England football team and so on, with a little X through all the players and so on who were not defined one way or another as being first or second or third generation immigrants, and it was the England football team without immigrants. And yeah, that's a lovely feel-good thing and so on, multicultural, multiracial England, et cetera, et cetera. But, viewed it from a slightly different perspective, that also is a kind of way of thinking that says to people who are not descended from immigrants, who are, if you like, the white British, as the census, puts it, that you are somehow second rate, that you would be nothing without immigrants. And there is a degree of truth in this. Obviously, if we look at something like the NHS, it depends on immigration for a large percentage of its workforce. But you have to be, I think, very careful about not implicitly and perhaps accidentally telling people who are not themselves of an immigrant background that they are in some way second rate and should be eternally grateful for the arrival of people from elsewhere in the world and so on. So again, how you talk about these issues, I think, really does matter. And I think elite media, and I would include the BBC in this, has often in recent years, for understandable reasons, placed such an emphasis on the importance and value of diversity in, to use a sort of catch-all term for it, that it sometimes overlooks the fact that, when you have discussions about, say, white privilege, if you're, growing up in hard-pressed circumstances in Stoke-on-Trent or Rotherham or something like that and so on, and you're white, you don't necessarily see yourself as being a privileged person, and for good reason. So again, a degree of nuance is required in discussing a lot of these issues.
I think you're absolutely right on the issue of language, because loose language, and when it comes to this kind of debate, language is never looser when it's around the issues of immigration and race. Sometimes it's deliberately loose in order to stoke up certain emotions, but it is absolutely an issue where all politicians should be very, very careful with the language that they use. The other thing which always strikes me about these stories, and of course, in terms of television news broadcasts, they're very much picture-led. They're picture-led when you see burning police cars. They're picture-led when you see people hurling missiles at the police. They're picture-led when you see shops being vandalized and so on. Sometimes it's possible just to lose sight of the fact that behind these images there are people who reside in this country, some of them fellow citizens, others who are waiting to have asylum applications processed, who are looking at this and who are genuinely very, very fearful. When a mosque is attacked, what does it say? And how do the people who go to that mosque to worship feel about what these pictures say about a degree of hatred which is targeted on them as individuals and as a community of people who live here who are British citizens? And I think that Starmer was absolutely on the money when he said it's the responsibility of the government to make individuals and communities feel safe in their own country. And I think that's why he was so indignant at the pictures that we have been seeing. Of course, we had a sort of small skirmish in Belfast. Belfast is a city which is not unknown to sort of disorder in relation to the police. I think that was probably quite separate and different from some of the stuff we've been seeing in English cities. Thankfully, we have been spared any of this kind of stuff in Scotland, which raises a question: is that because that communities in Scotland are more at ease with themselves, that some of the issues which are driving these protests do not exist in Scotland? I've always thought we've had a very, very complacent view here, that we're a much more liberal country. I think if you delve down into social attitudes and you look at social attitudes here to south of the border, the kind of views which are expressed, they're not a world apart. They're really not. Perhaps because just in terms of where people who are coming into the country, in terms of the net migration figures, tend to settle south of the border, that you don't see the kind of manifestations of the kind of disorder that we've seen in England. So is it the case, in your view, Alex, that we don't have it in Scotland because we're just more liberal, we're more tolerant, we get on with our neighbours, or the diversity within many communities that you get south of the border isn't seen in anything like the same way north of the border?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I mean, all the opinion polling over many years and so on is pretty clear on this. That it's true. People in Scotland tend to have a fairly liberal attitude on immigration issues. People in Scotland's views tend to be more or less the same as the views held by people in London. And these are, this is one of the ironies of, I think, that, Scotland and London tend to be quite alike on a number of issues. But of course, there is a significant difference, which is that London has seen an extraordinary surge in immigration over the last 30 years, and Scotland has not. And I think it is quite reasonable to wonder if Scottish attitudes towards migration and related issues would be quite as liberal and tolerant if they were tested in the same way as those attitudes are tested in London. That is to say, if Scotland had London levels of immigration, would Scotland still have London attitudes towards immigration? And I think that is a fair question, and most of us, I think, would suspect that the answer would be no, it wouldn't. that Scotland would actually start to look a little bit more like Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, the other cities of northern England, which have had more immigration than Scotland has. And this is one of the political problems or an economic problem, rather, for Scotland. There is a cross-party consensus at Holyrood that Scotland requires more immigration, more migrants from elsewhere in the world to come and support the economy, contribute, etc., 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 that this is vital for economic growth. But, although the UK has had an extremely liberal immigration system for the last 25 years, very few, relatively speaking, of those immigrants want to come to Scotland. So attracting people here is a real problem. And that hints at other issues about, economic and political culture, perhaps. Some of it may be climate related, but it can't all be that. Why is it that people, on the whole, all things being equal, don't want to come to Scotland? Why is it that they do not view Scotland as a place of opportunity the way they do view London, Birmingham, Manchester as places of opportunity? And that is, in some ways, a different discussion, but it is one that has particular economic issues that arise for Scotland and Scottish politics in the future, albeit it's some way distant from the disorder that we're seeing this week. And yes, of course, we should be very glad that thus far, there haven't been any significant signs of this kind of violence and hooliganism and bigotry, frankly, on streets in Scotland.
Yeah, of course, the new government have promised an asylum and immigration bill, where I think that to a certain extent they will try and reset many of the existing rules and reprioritize how they're dealing with issues of illegal immigration. And one of the things which Yvette Cooper has actually promised is that there will be more caseworkers to try and process asylum applications more quickly. Of course, you can, there were many people within the Conservative Party who said people are being here far too long. Well, one of the reasons that they were here far too long is that there was never enough caseworkers to process applications, and hundreds of millions of pounds were spent on the Rwanda scheme, which of course never got up and off and running because of the entirely predictable challenges in the courts claiming that this was an abuse of human rights. So the new government has a big job in this. It has the immediate job of dealing with the disorder. More broadly, it has the job of ensuring that people who are claiming asylum here have their claims heard, legitimate claims heard, but they're dealt with as timorously as possible. And of course, they will look at the rules around legal migration. One of the problems, and again, I think we've touched on this in previous discussions, the issue is not so much legal migration, people coming into the country, applying for visas in various categories. The issue is that people who come here in one visa category and simply disappear off the radar because there is no effective way of checking people in and out the country. Actually, I was watching on this an old YouTube interview with Tony Blair from several years ago, and he was making the point that one of the reasons why he was attracted by an ID card scheme was he thought it would be much more effective in keeping tabs on people, and that a lack of an ID card scheme made it more difficult to deal with the problem of illegal migration into the country, or people who are coming here legitimately on one visa but who simply do not go back. So there's a big job for the new government probably in resetting all of the rules. And I suspect that the issue of the numbers, the net migration numbers, is going to be a significant one for the new government. But the immediate priority is to deal with the disorder. And I think certainly in terms of the political management of this, both Sir Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper have been on top of it, and I think that they are showing leadership. Whether or not it will turn the situation around, I suspect we'll know the answer to that pretty quickly.
Yeah, and we began this discussion by saying this was the first big test, first big unexpected, unpredictable event to challenge the new government, and I think that's correct. But it's also therefore an opportunity. And it's a means of reinforcing, actually, Keir Starmer's core mission, which is that the machinery of government in this country has been broken. And it is time to fix it and get it back in working order. Now, how dealing quickly and severely, frankly, with the people causing and encouraging the violence we've seen over the last week is one way of doing that. If you look at the King's speech, there are also measures in that to beef up powers for the police to deal with antisocial behaviour, which I think will be very welcome, particularly in many of the communities that have seen, or many of the towns and cities that have seen violence this week. Those kinds of places tend to be the places where actually people do not want to defund the police, in the American phrase. They actually want to see more policing, in the same way as people, it is precisely people in, working class communities who tend to have the harshest views or the strongest views on things like benefit fraud. Because again, what people want is to see the rules applied equally and fairly. And uniformly, and if that happens, then people can put up with quite a lot of personal inconvenience, or with things that they perhaps themselves wouldn't particularly like. But if they believe that things are happening in a fair and consistent manner, then they can get on with it. It's where people see different groups or different categories of people being treated differently and granted particular privileges based on those differences, that's where trouble starts brewing, because people think it's unfair. And so, again, this is an opportunity for the government, for the new government, a Labour government, to actually assert both the efficiency and capability of the state in terms of responding to this disorder, but more generally in insisting that the rules are the rules. And if you play by the rules, then you will be absolutely fine. But if you break the rules, if you insist on special privileges, then you will not receive these, and you will be you will be dealt with properly. And that is something that I think will actually play well, because at root there is still a core sense of that fairness is what counts, and that is something that voters in this country, I think, still do respond quite keenly to.
Well, one of the things that we have said before is that we're going to, on this podcast, do perhaps some one-off specials. I think probably a subject for a one-off special will be this precise subject, where we can take you through what the issues are around asylum applications, what the issues are around legal migration, what the issues are around illegal migration, what the net migration figures say, what they're made up of, and to take you through and navigate your way through what is an extremely complicated subject. But we will come back to that on a future podcast. If you want to get in touch, the email address is ponsonbymassey@gmail.com. And on X, what used to be Twitter, it's @PonsonbyMassey. Get in touch with your questions. When we compile a number of them, we'll do a show answering some of them, or answering them at least as best we can. If you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, please do get in touch. There's an old retired man here who would like to have a summer holiday. So if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, please do get in touch. But for the moment, from me, it is goodbye.
And it's goodbye from me.